Okay, so welcome everybody to our session on the situation in Crimea and Donbass. My name is Maya Pankyu. I am the media director on SUSK, and I'm also one of the contributors to the Russian aggression campaign that we are holding right now during the month of May. So just before we begin, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of this panel session. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end. And I'm very delighted to have our guest speakers, Ambassador Andriy Shevchenko and Ambassador Roman Waschuk. And I can read you their bios so you get to know a little bit more about them. So Ambassador Andriy Shevchenko, Mr. Shevchenko is the ambassador of Ukraine to Canada. He is a seasoned journalist, civil activist, and a human rights defender. Mr. Shevchenko has also accomplished an outstanding career in politics and media. For example, Ambassador Shevchenko is a sponsor of 60 legislative acts adopted by the Ukrainian parliament. That includes the Law of Access to Information, a cornerstone of the Ukrainian anti-corruption legislature. Mr. Shevchenko was an active participant on the Euromaidan protests. He was deeply involved in organizing peaceful demonstrations and protection of the protesters from the brutal violence by the police and legal repressions by the authorities. Thank you for joining us tonight, Ambassador Shevchenko.
My pleasure.
Our second guest is Ambassador Roman Waschuk. Mr. Waschuk was the ambassador of Canada to Ukraine from 2014 to 2019. Mr. Waschuk received the UCC Taras Shevchenko Medal in 2020 for his outstanding contribution to public service. Ambassador Waschuk worked to bring Canada-Ukraine relations to a new level at the time of increased interest in Ukraine. With his depth of knowledge of Ukraine, he was a leader amongst ambassadors in Kyiv and fully developed the Canadian presence in Ukraine. Ambassador Waschuk practiced diplomacy with integrity, openness, sincerity, and accessibility and optimism. Thank you for joining us tonight, Ambassador Waschuk.
You're very welcome.
Perfect. Okay, so I think we can start with our questions. So the first one that we have for you tonight is, would you be able to give us a brief overview of the current situation in Crimea and Donbass, and what is Russia's short-term and long-term plan for Ukraine?
Can I take a kick at that? I think the basic Russian approach is to reintegrate Ukraine into its sphere of influence. President Putin keeps talking about Ukrainians and Russians being one people, один народ, and how he and people around him feel that the whole independence thing and even the whole Soviet Ukraine thing were big misunderstandings of this great one people. And so their problem also is, because of that, they refuse to take Ukraine seriously. They think it's a temporary thing that will go away if they just push hard enough. What they've done instead since 2014 is push hard enough that Ukrainian consciousness, not necessarily ethno-linguistic, but political consciousness, has been strengthened across the country. So in a way, by making the wrong assumptions about Ukraine, President Putin has got largely the opposite of what he had been counting on. And we see further proof of that in that, regardless of who's the president of Ukraine, the willingness to give up independence is just not there, and the determination to defend it remains strong.
Yes, I agree.
And I think I'll just add a couple of more words, and if you might allow me to share a map, can I do that?
I believe you can. Actually, one moment.
Sure. And okay, So this is just for us to see the broad picture which is happening around us. I'll just add that I think with Crimea and with Donbass, those two cases are in some ways different, but in so many ways they are similar. And obviously both of them are de facto occupied by Russia, and Crimea was illegally annexed in 2014. And by the way, this is the Washington Post map, and we can question some wording here, but this will just present us some picture. Donbass today is a tribal land where no rule of law is expected to be found. Crimea is turned into a major military base by Russia. So those are some differences, but of course they have a lot in common. Again, both of them are de facto under Russian control. Second, Ukrainians are not welcomed there. If you speak Ukrainian or if you go to a Ukrainian church, you are an enemy. And it's not just about Ukrainians. If you're a Crimean Tatar and if you go to mosque, or if you're a Baptist or or some other denomination, you'll be oppressed, or you might be arrested or tortured or even killed just for presenting your identity. Then both these regions under Russian control, they pose a major threat to security in the region, not just for Ukraine, but to the whole neighborhood. Both cost us human lives, lost or broken. And if you cannot get a proper education, if you cannot find a McDonald's if around you, if you cannot fly to a foreign country from where you live, if you have no chances to get a good university diploma and many other things, you're still alive, but it pretty much means your life is quite broken, and it will take a lot of effort to fix it. Finally, we will see both of them becoming again an integral part of Ukraine, and that's probably the major common thing between them, the two of them. Mm-hmm. And just one more thought, since we hear, I think we have a lot of people who have been actively advocating for support of Ukraine. I would strongly encourage all of us to see both Donbass and Crimea as part of the same story. Of course, there are many differences, but again, we see both of them as part of one operation by Russia, and we want the whole world to address it that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both, and thank you for sharing that visual. That was very helpful. So our next question is, do you believe that DNR and LNR, so the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, should be declared terrorist organizations like the UCC and the UWC have called for?
I can start with briefly saying, yes, they are terrorist organizations, and it's important to call them that way for many reasons, including the legal reasons. One of the avenues that Ukraine is pursuing against Russia, one of the legal avenues that we are pursuing against Russia is we want to hold Russia responsible for financing terrorism. And there is an international legal framework on that, which means that we have better chances to hold Russia accountable for those terrible things that they have been doing in Ukraine.
I think declaring them terrorist organizations will have a sort of give a sort of moral satisfaction, but won't practically change a whole lot about their lives. They're unrecognized entities as they are, and the real power behind them is the Russian military and the secret services and the so-called kuratori from Moscow, the shadow puppeteers who run the so-called ministries of these so-called entities. I guess this then brings us back to the point that Lesikichi made in her op-ed earlier this week, which is that in that respect, Russia is a kind of terrorist state. Certainly its sidekick Belarus has proven that over the last 2 days. So we have essentially states and puppet entities that don't play by the rules. One of the problems that I constantly saw for Ukraine is that because of the great international engagement, everyone expects Ukraine to play by all the rules. And that means to some extent, you are dealing with these, with Russia and with its puppet entities with one hand tied behind your back. And being very closely monitored by UN missions, OSCE missions, etc., to make sure that you don't make a misstep. So when people are wondering, why isn't Ukraine more decisive? Why doesn't it just bash all these people? Well, in certain respects, it can't, because it's made promises, human rights, due process, etc., that mean that it is constrained by rules that its opponents don't feel the need to abide by.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So our next question is, Ukrainian soldiers continue to be killed on the front line. What is required to ensure a true ceasefire?
I can start, and again, I have some visual to share on this. This map represents, and these numbers represent what Russia and their proxies have in the occupied territories. And that's a lot of manpower, and that's a lot of weapons. And those are the 2 army corps that Ambassador Waschuk has just mentioned, which are under the Russian control. So the first answer to your question is, we strongly believe that the key to peace in Donbass is in Moscow. And this comes from our deep understanding that all this military force that we see in Donbass, it's all under effective Russian control. And I can give you one example. We all remember this terrible case of MH17, which was shot down by this Russian Buk missile. So that missile was brought by Russian regular troops from a Russian regular base. The decision to fire it was taken by the Russian officers, and those who did that terrible crime, they finally they fled back to Russia. So this pretty much shows the way how the chain of command is operating in the occupied territories of Ukraine. So, but of course, when you see all this manpower and all these weapons which is in the region, I think we should be very realistic that even when we have this Moscow's goodwill to stop the war, which is not in sight for now, but even when we have it, this probably will not stop the fighting immediately. There are a lot of crazy people with a lot of weapons in that land. But one way or another, this is our direction to proceed. So we have to force Russia to do some action to stop fighting, to have the real ceasefire as the step 1, and then to proceed with demilitarization of the region and with what we call the political process. And then on the human level, we should realize that every year that this problem is not solved, it's going to be more and more difficult to do. And Ambassador Waschuk has spent some of years of his incredible diplomatic career at the Balkans. And we know that when we see fighting on the ground, when we have more and more coffins between people, it's becoming more and more difficult, more and more complicated to get back peace. So it's not going to be an easy walk. And again, on the other side of this peace process, we have someone who is not interested and shows no signs of interest in peace for now. But this is the way to move forward. And I am absolutely sure that we are capable of building a good and sustainable peace on the ground. And Maya, I would like to acknowledge that we are also joined today by some people from our embassy team, and we have Oksana Kizima of ours, who has Hromada and who has the Canadian universities as part of her portfolio. And also we have Colonel Victor Siromacha, who is our defense attaché, who is listening to this conversation. So I just encourage my colleagues, if they feel that they have something to add, I encourage them to ask for Maya's permission and jump in on this.
Yes, they definitely are welcomed and encouraged to participate if they choose to. And thank you for joining us too, both. It is a pleasure to have you.
If I could maybe just add to what Ambassador Shevchenko has said, that graphic he showed, the numbers, main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, mobile, cannon, etc. Those numbers, and these are just the units that are in Donbass, armed by Russia, are bigger than the amount of armor of several major European NATO armies put together. So, you know, this force is supposedly, according to Putin, just a bunch of coal miners and farmers who found the odd tank in a garage and pulled it all together. Obviously not. It's fully integrated into the Russian warfighting machine. It alone is obviously a challenge for Ukraine, but a challenge it could handle. And in fact, in 2014, when the sort of rebel entities were just getting going, the Ukrainian army almost snuffed them out. It was only when the Russian regular forces came across the border and also just shot rockets raining destruction on Ukrainian forces from within Russia that this kind of rump Donbass was left. So, you know, we remember in April, the big Russian mobilization when we saw train loads of tanks heading across the country towards Ukraine. The Russians can muster a whole lot more tanks than 420. So Ukraine needs to help develop its deterrent capacity, defense capacity. That's what Operation Unifier has been doing for the past 5-6 years. The Ukrainian army is a much better army. It's a battle-hardened army. It's an army that Colonel Siromacha can be proud of. And even today, we saw something quite unfamiliar. The co-chair of the German Green Party saying after visiting Ukraine that he thinks Germany should supply defensive weapons to Ukraine because self-defense and a deterrent capacity improves the chances of Ukraine working out a diplomatic settlement with Russia. If Russia realizes that Ukraine is no pushover, that there is international backing for it, then the negotiating table maybe isn't quite level, but it's leveled off slightly and allows for more effective negotiations. So warfighting and negotiating are not mutually exclusive. They happen at the same time. And it's a matter of how we can, through things like Op Unifier, help Ukraine to be a more persuasive and dissuasive negotiating partner.
Those are some really good points to bring up. So our next question is, we hear about both a Normandy format and Minsk process. Please explain the peace process and is it working?
Let me maybe take a first kick at that, since I'm less constrained by policy maybe. It was often repeated in my Kyiv days that there is no alternative to Minsk, by which they mean the Minsk Accords, the agreements that were struck in September 2014 and February 2015, both at times when Russian regular forces were pouring over and threatening Ukraine. And And then the Normandy format was is called that because there was a meeting in summer of 14 where there was an agreement that France and Germany would join Russia and Ukraine in trying to work out a settlement. Both of these are processes that are stuck. The conflict, I guess the negotiations are frozen. The conflict is not. The conflict is it's not a totally hot conflict. You could see it's sort of a tepid conflict where people keep dying every week. But no major changes have happened on the front line. I think that there was an article this week by Mark Galeotti, who's a pretty good analyst of things Eastern European. And he said maybe it's time for some countries that aren't Germany and aren't France to say, actually, Minsk is dead. If you've been talking about something for 6 years and nobody's been able to successfully interpret or implement what's been agreed, maybe this format ain't working. And maybe there's a need to re-examine the format and re-examine the underlying assumptions behind them. So, this is obviously something that's very difficult for France and Germany to accept, because not only did their leaders negotiate this in 2014-15, they've seen it as a matter of honor as a European leadership role to try and fix it. They haven't really succeeded. I think President Zelensky has suggested other countries could be invited in to mix it up a bit in terms of the format. Maybe that would help break the logjam, but I'll leave that to Ambassador Shevchenko.
Well, just to continue what you, Roman, have been saying, I can give it a try with some black humor in this conversation. And we have this, again, it's a risky joke, but I'll give it a try, that the Minsk process is it's like Vladimir Lenin, who is dead, but he is not buried yet. So that's what many people feel about the Minsk process. So it's a very difficult process from the very beginning, and we do not see much progress. But maybe for those who listen to us and who are not that familiar with the technical details, I'll just say 2 words, what's the difference between the two. So the Normandy is for the big decisions, and it's about 4 leaders, and you can see Zelensky, Macron, Putin, and Merkel in this picture. It was started with Poroshenko and with President Hollande for France. Actually, I like this picture because I think it reflects the different moods around the table, and you can see that Zelensky obviously doesn't seem to be the happiest person in the room, and I guess he shouldn't be. And you can see this well-concentrated Chancellor Merkel, and you can see the French president trying to bring some light feelings into the room. And that is a very difficult thing to do in this type of conversations. So again, the Normandy format is for the big decisions. And the contact group in Minsk, Minsk is home for this 3-party contact group, which includes Ukraine, Russia, and the OSCE as a mediator and moderator of this difficult conversation. The Russian proxies from Donetsk and Luhansk are not a party in Minsk. Russia speaks on their behalf. They might be part of the Russian delegation, but we choose to talk to Russia directly, not to waste our time with their proxies. And I was looking for a good metaphor to explain the difference between the Normandy format and the Minsk group. And what I have in mind is like when you want to build a house, you will probably have a very small group of people to make very important decisions, like what type of a house you're going to build. So it's like a very small and intimate committee for big decisions, like how many floors, what do you want to have there? And then you will contract more people to get this done. And so actually this 3-party contact group in Minsk was designed to implement the big decisions which were expected from the Normandy format. But here comes something which was just explained by Ambassador Waschuk, that this four parties format of Normandy has never produced big sustainable decisions so far. So that's why Ukraine believes that we should be open to some other creative diplomatic solutions. That's why many people in Ukraine would like to see more parties around this table. And I think it was the Washington Post, was it FT, that President Zelensky talked to, and he said that we would like to see the United States of America, the UK, and Canada as part of this peace process, as part of this conversation. So anticipating our further conversation about the role that Canada can play, yes, Ukraine would like to see Canada being more involved in this peace process with Russia. It's not going to be an easy one, but I think it's something which is critically important for the security of our region and the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for explaining it in that really interesting way with the house. That did help me understand it at least. So our next question is, Zelensky has been asking Putin to meet. Why does he want that so badly, and why is Putin refusing?
I can start. The main reason is because we believe in diplomacy, and as you can imagine, Putin is not the most pleasant date, but we want the whole world to know that we are ready to work towards peace, and we are ready to sit down with Putin if necessary. And that also means that we have very strict red lines for this kind of conversations. And I think in that sense, President Zelensky can count on very strong support across the party lines in Ukraine. The red lines are very clear. The way President Zelensky explains that, he says we are not going to have compromise on our land and on our people. And this, of course, might require a lot of details to explain it. But again, going back to the question, yes, we are ready to do whatever is necessary to get sustainable peace. And yes, we have very strong and very strict and very, very clear red lines on how we are going to get there.
I think as well, President Zelensky came into office believing that let's all be reasonable. Surely there must be reasonable people who can agree that this war is a bad idea, and that if we just sit down and look each other in the eye, we can figure this out. I think he's discovered that Mr. Putin is a pretty hard-boiled character and not that easy to deal with. As international partners, I'd say we all have a slight kind of miss a heartbeat when we hear these occasional sorties from Kyiv saying, I'll meet him anywhere, I'll go and talk, tell him and get peace. Actually, Ukraine and Russia one-on-one, given the differing sort of the power differential, is a less than ideal format. Now, admittedly, I think the president feels that he's got the personality and persuasive powers to make up for that. But I think most Western partners would probably think that the best options would be in a more multilateral format where there's a bit more balance around the table. Although acknowledging that one of the problems with Normandy is that sometimes your friends can be the ones who are pushing you to make concessions so that something happens. So that's one of the things that Ukraine's friends need to watch out, is that they don't, in trying to help Ukraine, push it more than they need to, because they find it easier to get concessions from Ukraine than from Russia. That's where sort of your diplomats get into their own special headspace of trying to make progress, or the appearance of progress for appearance's sake. And that is not a good place to be.
And Maya, if you allow me, I just would like to subscribe with what Roman has just said, that one-on-one with Russia is not our most desirable option. We do want to have more parties being part of this, and not just because we enjoy a lot of people around the table, but just for very obvious reasons, because we're seeking a good, sustainable solution, which will be supported by the free world, and which will be supported by many other parties. And I do not know, Maya, if we're allowed to answer the questions which we already see in the Q&A, but I see one question which is probably is a good moment to answer. And Boris Gengalo from Ottawa asks us if we can separate the personal aims of Putin from the wider desires of the Russian Siloviki, which are the law enforcements, and the general Russian population. And I'll just share my personal view. Well, there is school of thought that once we get rid of Putin, everything is going to be back to normal. I do not share that. I think Putin is not the source of the problems that we have with Russia, but he is in many ways, he is a reflection of the Russian ruling class, and he is a reflection of the Russian society, which means bad news for us, which means we'll have to deal with this kind of Russia maybe for generations and maybe for decades. And this means that now when we see Russia being very anti-Western and very xenophobic, very aggressive, probably it's our reality, or it's our new normal for many years. And those who studied diplomacy and international law, they can, of course, think of the Cannon's long telegram of 1946, where he tries to explain to the American public, or rather to the State Department, how to read Stalin and how to read the communist Russia. And I think it really strikes how relevant his observations are about Putin's Russia that we can see right now. So sorry for this long answer to this question from Boris, but I would say that we should realize that it's not just about Putin. We are dealing with this very complicated player, and this means we have to take it very seriously and very strategically, long term.
I'll allow myself to actually be more optimistic than Ambassador Shevchenko in this respect. And maybe it's the product of my 3 years in Moscow during the perestroika years, which was, okay, a bit of an aberration, but shows that Russia is not necessarily predestined only for a kind of despotic future. Yes, I mean, there's deep societal beliefs in Russia that lead it to this kind of imperial mindset, but it requires the kind of individual, in this case, President Putin, to actualize that and to trigger it to its full extent. And I think his notion that he is a reincarnation of Peter the Great, or of Ivan Kalita, or all of them, collecting the Rus lands around Moscow. I'm still hopeful that some future leader might have a different emphasis. And again, once change processes start, they don't necessarily go in some linear fashion. So yes, there are underlying societal problems beyond President Putin, but his departure, I think, will provide nonetheless some opportunity for redirection.
Thank you both for those insightful answers. So one more question before we get to the Q&A. What is the global community doing to recognize Crimea as a Ukrainian state, and what should they be doing? And with that, I can add in, is pushing the NATO members to accept Ukraine as a member a part of the solution to this?
Okay, well, maybe I was representing a NATO member, so I'll take a crack at question number 2 and maybe leave Crimea and its platform to Ambassador Shevchenko. I think, we've lived with this half-baked NATO Bucharest decision at the NATO Bucharest Summit 2008, where President Bush wanted Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. Some countries, notably Germany, France, these names repeat themselves somehow in different scenarios, thought rather not. And so there was this compromise saying, yes, the door is open and foreign ministers at some point will decide on this. That was 13 years ago. Ukraine then went through a period under President Yanukovych as a non-aligned neutral country. It was in its neutral status that it had Crimea taken and annexed and the Donbass conflict initiated. So Ukraine wasn't at that point striving to join NATO, and nor was NATO trying to pull it in. The public support for Ukraine joining NATO, in fact, came after Russia attacked. Compared to pre-2013 times, support now has pretty much tripled from about 15, 20% to 48, 50, 60%, depending on the polls you read. And the proportion is 2 to 1 in terms of people in favor and people against. So if there's a referendum on NATO membership, the outcome would be pretty much 2 to 1 in favor. So my view and Canada's view, which Canada is in favor of the open door policy, i.e. Ukraine being able to join, is that in fact, it was Ukraine being part of the buffer, not nailed down space that made it vulnerable to Russia. And that if it had received in an alternate universe a NATO membership plan in 2008, quite likely we would never have had the conflict. And we would now actually today have better relations between Russia and the West, because they wouldn't be poisoned by the opportunistic grab of Crimea and Donbass that Russia was able to undertake in 2014, because Ukraine didn't have any security guarantees, real ones, not just Budapest piece of paper memorandum ones.
If you allow me, I'll just add one more thing on NATO, and then we'll turn to Crimea. And on NATO, I'll just say that from where we stand, we see ourselves already as a de facto eastern flank of NATO. There are many people in Ukraine who feel that we are defending the free world and we are defending Europe from the Russian aggression. And that probably explains why Ukraine wants so badly to go ahead with this, aside of many other very practical reasons and ideological reasons too. And one more thing, since we are now dealing with mostly Canadian audience, I'll just say that Canada is, I believe, is in a very special position when it comes to this discussion or debate on the Ukraine's aspiration for NATO. Because of your very visible and very important military presence in Ukraine. And again, even as we speak, we have these extraordinary trainers from Operation Unifier who train Ukrainian soldiers and officers. And there are about 200 people who are 200 people in the uniforms who are the Canadian deployment to Ukraine. And by now we have almost around 20,000 Ukrainians who have been through this Canadian training. So when there is a discussion about Ukraine and NATO in Brussels, ideally we would like we'd like Canada to have a very strong voice and very vocal position on that. We would like your unifier commanders telling their NATO counterparts all the benefits and all the challenges of Ukraine being a NATO member, because you're really in a perfect position to know that. And it's not just because of the unifier, but it's also because of your very important involvement into the Ukrainian reforms. And we keep saying that NATO is not just about the armed forces, it's a much broader scope of issues. And again, Canada has invested so much in the Ukrainian reforms, and you are all over the place in the good sense, whether it's the national police or agriculture or decentralization, you would see this very important Canadian presence there. And when Ambassador Waschuk was in Kyiv and Canada chaired G7, That was the time of very important Canadian leadership throughout the G7 community. And then Canada hosted this extraordinary Ukraine Reform Conference in Toronto in 2019. And I'm bringing more and more of those examples so that Canada should be very confident that if there is a country in the world which has very good knowledge of Ukraine, which has very good understanding, which has very good expertise in Ukraine, that's Canada. So that's why we are so enthusiastic about Canada being a very vocal voice, very strong voice when it comes to this conversation about Ukraine and NATO. And now just a couple of words about the Crimean platform. We are launching this international initiative on Crimea for a very obvious reason, because Crimea was never part of the Normandy format, which we have discussed earlier. And I have a very obvious historical parallel. It's what we saw with the Baltic nations. The West made very strong decision not to recognize the Soviet occupation of the Baltic countries in the beginning of World War II. And eventually we saw the Baltic countries regaining their independence. So I think now very strong and clear position on non-recognizing of the illegal annexation of Crimea means that you are on the right side of history, and there is a very good chance that eventually you will see history coming back to your position. So we expect Canada to be a very important part of this new initiative, which is called the Crimean Platform. And we feel very strong support from Canada, not just on this, but on many other issues. We see Canada as a de facto leader, or one of the key leaders of this international coalition to support Ukraine's independence, and it's greatly appreciated. And just one last anecdote on that is, just a couple of weeks ago, together with Colonel Siromacha, we had a chance to meet Sarah here, who was the last unifier commander in Ukraine. And she told us the story when she was traveling through Ukraine and they had to stop at a gas station. And someone at the gas station in Ukraine saw these Canadian chevrons on their uniforms. And so they asked the Canadians, like, what are you guys doing there? And once they said that they're from Canada and they're part of this unifier training mission, and they saw Ukrainians who were trying just to hug them. And they were a little bit stressed because of all the COVID restrictions. But she shared this story, and we saw so much warmth in her eyes, because that's probably when you feel how much appreciated your presence is, your support is. And that's what we feel about Canada.
That reminds me of when I was talking to the first couple of rotations of Operation Unifier personnel, and they were coming in still very much under the impression that they were going into a Afghanistan or Iraq kind of mission. And I told them, actually, no, your main threat here will be people wanting to hug you. Now, with COVID, that has taken on another meaning, but that's basically what it's come to.
Thank you for sharing those.
And I should also acknowledge that I think Ambassador Waschuk personally contributed a lot into this change of policy that we see with the unifier. We see them reaching out to the public so much more than in the first years. And I think the very fact of this Canadian presence in Ukraine, it helps us. It's a very strong signal towards Russia that Ukraine is not alone in this. So I think this major shift of policy to be more open and to show your presence, I think it was a very important decision, and we greatly appreciate that.
And they've discovered social media type ways of signaling. I think 2 days ago, I sort of saw a night shot of the Kharkiv skyline from the current commander, Colonel Melanie Lake, saying, "Good night, Kharkiv." That's all it said. But to anyone who knows that other military missions have never gone as far east as Kharkiv in terms of training, that's significant.
And one last story. Sorry, I cannot resist. Well, I had a chance to visit the unifier to visit Yavori with the unifier deployments 2 times. I think Ambassador Waschuk has done this many times more. So the last time when I was there, it was last year with Minister Champagne, with the Canadian Foreign Minister Champagne, and with Ambassador Galadze. And there was this moment when we saw this Canadian officer standing next to his Ukrainian counterpart, and there was a huge military strategic map behind them. And this Canadian officer was telling to the Canadian Minister Champagne, he was saying, look, we all read this map exactly the same way. We speak the same language. And we both play the blue team. And at the Soviet military maps, the good guys were the red team, and the bad NATO guys were the blue team. So those small details to really show you that it's a very different universe. And now when we see those Ukrainian commanders and Canadian commanders next to the same map, reading it in exactly the same way, not wasting a single second trying to understand the differences, that's exactly the same interoperability that we are seeking between Ukraine and NATO. And that's exactly what our goal is on that.
Yes, thank you. Those are all very interesting stories. And I hope that soon maybe Ukrainians can hug Canadians again after all of this. Okay, so we're going to move on to our Q&A session. And then we are nearing the end of our hour. So the first question that we have here is, Biden and Putin will be meeting on June 16th. Will Ukraine be a topic of conversation? And if not, what can we do to ensure that it is?
From what I've seen today, the White House has advised that both Ukraine and Belarus will be part of the discussions at the June 16th summit. So it's happening. We don't need to ensure it. It's happened. The question is, what will President Biden do about it? And I think he's got a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge. Victoria Nuland, Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Blinken. Their possible downfall is hoping for sweet reason. That let's give everyone a break, let's give everyone a chance, and that the Russians will seize it to have a stable and predictable relationship. And I think one of the problems is that President Putin has had such successes as he's had, and they've been mitigated successes, but still precisely by being unpredictable and opportunistic and leveraging his smaller power set quickly and unexpectedly over the last 10 years. So people who love rules and love predictability, they're going to have to get used to that.
I'll just say one sentence. I think we are cautiously confident about this meeting. We expect President Biden to be a very strong supporter of Ukraine during that very difficult conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so our last question from the audience is, how serious is the threat that pro-Russian parties and interests in Ukraine pose to the Ukrainian state?
Well, interestingly, we've seen now that President Zelensky has moved against Mr. Medvedchuk, and first his media empire and now his parliamentary status, that there's been no huge groundswell of public support saying, don't touch our lovely Mr. Medvedchuk. He is representing everything we stand for. We haven't seen that. On the contrary, what we've seen is, in fact, a growth in President Zelensky's popularity rating, because people like to see decisive action and they like to see rich, nasty people brought down. And Medvedchuk, apart from being pro-Russian, is also rich and nasty. So framed right, it turns out that the threat, if you confront it, is not that great. If you allow it to infiltrate your system and fester, yes, then it becomes a big problem.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also add that, of course, Putin and Russia will try to play their cards in Ukrainian politics, and it's not new to us. And I think obviously it's not over. I do not see it as a political threat in the electoral sense right now. I think we are quite safe and quite confident. I have a lot of confidence in the political landscape of Ukraine right now. I think the bigger problem is this very famous and infamous Ukrainian political infighting. And if you read Ukrainian history, whether we talk about UNR, Ukrainska Народная Республика, or some other periods, it's always heartbreaking to see how much energy, how much time, how much money, and how many human lives were lost because of this inability of good and not so good Ukrainians to work together on a common cause. So I think that is an eternal challenge for Ukraine when it comes to politics. But again, I think we have become a much more mature society in the political sense. And I think now we have much more capability of really working together as one nation, as one political class with very clear goals. That's at least an optimist in myself wants to see it that way.
I would maybe also add that if you're looking at Ukraine from the outside, you shouldn't necessarily just pick one favorite and say, oh, this is my person in Ukrainian politics, and everything they say and everything they write about on Facebook must be true. It's a big, complicated country. And just like politics in Canada is complex, regional, multi-level, personalities play a role. In Ukraine, if anything, that's kind of like to the next power. More complex with the additional historical baggage and regional conflict added to it. So it's not simply looking at it as my favorite bunch are the good guys, they must be right, and everybody else are the bad guys. I think that there's a need to take a sort of a slightly distanced, nuanced look and not live the emotional roller coaster of a Ukrainian and Ukraine-related social media every day.
Absolutely. So our last question, because we have a lot of young students that follow SUSK and are a part of our community. So we want to know, as post-secondary Ukrainian students in Canada, is there anything that we can do to contribute in spreading awareness and advocating for Ukrainians rights?
Well, maybe as a former SUSK member, certainly being aware of the evolving situation, but with a sort of applying your critical thinking skills to both Ukraine and Canada, but also providing not just criticism, but positive feedback for those things which you feel are going well. I think things like Operation Unifier, civil society development, women's voice Ukraine, etc. These are initiatives that I think our government wants to hear from happy stakeholders, not just from unhappy agitators. You can say, you should do more in terms of lobbying for Ukraine at NATO. Yes, but there are a number of very good things that Canada has done and that you can also get involved in, so that there are opportunities. Check out some of the ads that are being put up by an outfit called Surge, SURGE, who provide expert advice to Ukrainian ministries. They're both professional jobs and entry-level jobs that are posted. Some of them might be of interest to SUSK members as well. So there are practical ways you can help. Those of you who are part of the reserves, in terms of the military or at RMC, other places, you can end up being cultural interpreters for trainers in Op Unifier. So there's a number of ways to get involved, get engaged. And I think what we also would like to see is, of course, that those contributions that Canada and Canadians make need to be respected and maintained in Ukraine. It's always a bit sad to see something you've worked on get taken apart because of a not invented here change of government factor in Ukraine. And so that's also, with all the supportive feelings we have, a desire, I think, that Canadians should expect that either what people on the community level have done or government to government, that there is a measure of understanding and respect for that contribution.
A couple of years ago, I think it was 2018, both Ambassador Waschuk and myself, we were at this event in Toronto, and it was an appreciation night for the Unifier personnel. And that was a very impressive event when we hear all these things about Ukraine and Canada, not from the usual suspects, including us, but from men and women in uniforms, Canadian servicemen and servicewomen. That was very impressive. I also remember General Winnick being with us, who is now in Alberta, and I see Marko Levitsky from Edmonton on the list of participants. So I know that there are some Albertans listening to us. So I think I heard from one of the Canadians, he said, look, I've been to several missions abroad, overseas, but this is actually the first time we get this kind of appreciation and thanks and kudos. And I think those people were really touched to hear all the beautiful, wonderful words from the Ukrainian Canadian community, from the general public. I think they brought this feeling of pride to Canada, to see that Canada has this very important impact footprint somewhere far away. So if we are serious about Canada advancing its values globally, I think Ukraine is the best partner in that. So the reason I remember this night, I just want to encourage all of you, tell your government that you appreciate what they do to support Ukraine. And I think it's as simple as that, because quite often politicians and the government, they do not deserve good words, or they do not hear those good words often enough. But I think it's something that all of us want to hear, at least from time to time. So overall, I think it would be fair to say that we appreciate a lot what Canada has been doing for Ukraine. Of course, there is always a lot of things that can be done. But again, I think it's a true leadership on the global stage, on the global arena. And just to wrap up this conversation, I'll say that I'm very impressed. Well, first I'll say that it's very important to, I think it's very nice to do this event with Ambassador Waschuk. I had the pleasure and the blessing to work with him during his years in Kyiv. And it's nice to have the same feeling, Romane. And I know that quite often, both him and me, we had to brief our leadership, your Prime Minister or our President, exactly on the same questions that you, Maya, asked us about. So pretty much that is the level of the conversation. You pretty much had this presidential or prime ministerial briefing today when we tried to capture the key things which are happening around Ukraine and around Russia. So kudos to Susk for doing this. I'm very impressed with your profound interest in these topics. And I think it's a good choice, because those are the questions that many key world leaders have on their tables and in their briefing rooms right now, today. And they're trying to answer exactly the same questions that you ask. Finally, I'll just say, if you want to understand the world today, study Ukraine. If you want to understand the security challenges in the 21st century, study the Ukrainian situation. And if you want to know something about all the fun things which are happening, also look at Ukraine. So thank you for paying attention to Ukraine and to these very important topics.
And I'd also flag that if you're looking at themes in Canadian foreign policy, especially Women, Peace and Security, and Feminist International Assistance Policy, follow Larisa Galadza, my esteemed successor as ambassador to Ukraine, who has been a real leader in these areas over the past year and a half, and surely will be into the future as well.
So thank you both. With that, we're finished with all of our questions, and I wanted to express on behalf of Susk and myself our sincere gratitude that you were able to come and give your time and answer these very important questions that I'm sure a lot of people learned a lot from. Yeah, I'm very glad that you were able to join us. One more thing on behalf of Susk, we have one more session in our Russian aggression information campaign, and this is the disinformation event that's happening on Thursday at 1:00 p.m. and it is specifically for students only, and there are 7 spots left, so we encourage all of our viewers who are students to go and register for that. But that being said, thank you very much, and that brings us to the end of our panel session.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Дякую.